On the island of Saint Helena, in the final years of his life, Napoleon Bonaparte spent considerable hours dictating. He dictated his memoirs, his accounts of the campaigns, his version of the political history of the era he had dominated. He dictated letters and observations and reflections on everything from military strategy to the nature of power to the qualities of the generals who had served under him. The dictation was partly the project of shaping his own legacy. The deliberate construction of the Napoleon that posterity would remember, assembled from the inside by the man himself, in the only arena still available to him. But some of what he dictated was not for posterity in the general sense. Some of it was for one person specifically. For a boy in Vienna who was growing up under a different name, in a different language, inside a world that had been carefully constructed to place the maximum possible distance between him and everything his father represented. Napoleon dictated pages of advice, observation, and instruction addressed to his son: what to read, how to think about history, what qualities a leader needed to cultivate and which ones would destroy him, how to understand the nature of power and its relationship to the people subject to it, what mistakes Napoleon himself had made and what those mistakes had cost, and what the son might do differently if the son were ever in a position to act on any of it. He never stopped to reckon, in those dictation sessions, with the probability that none of it would arrive. That the boy in Vienna was growing up in a court that had every reason to manage his relationship with his father's memory as carefully as possible. Which meant limiting it, shaping it, ensuring that the Duke of Reichstadt, as the boy had become, remained a historical curiosity rather than a political possibility. Napoleon knew this. At some level he always knew this, but the knowing did not stop the dictating. Because the dictating was also something else. Not only instruction for a son, but conversation with the only person Napoleon could imagine talking to honestly at the end of everything. The son who had not yet become anyone, who was therefore still capable of becoming anything, who existed in Napoleon's imagination as the recipient of everything he had learned that there was no longer any use for. The boy's name at birth had been Napoleon Francois Joseph Charles Bonaparte. He had been born on March 20th, 1811, in the Tuileries Palace in Paris to Napoleon Bonaparte and his second wife Marie-Louise of Austria. The birth had been attended with the full ceremony appropriate to the arrival of an imperial heir. Guns fired, officials notified, Europe informed. Napoleon had wept at the birth, which was one of the few times in his public life that his characteristic emotional control had been visibly overtaken. He had held the child, and the child had been real, in a way that the empire and the victories and the political constructions were not, in the most fundamental sense, real. The child had been given the title King of Rome immediately upon his birth. It was a title with precedent in the old imperial vocabulary of Europe. The heir to the Holy Roman Emperor had traditionally carried it, and Napoleon's adoption of it for his son was a statement about the lineage he was claiming for his dynasty. The child was not merely the heir of Napoleon Bonaparte, the Corsican outsider who had stormed the gates of European civilization. He was the heir of a tradition that predated and transcended Napoleon himself. At least, that was the claim the title was making. The child had 3 years in Paris, in the Tuileries, growing in the world that had been prepared for him. There are accounts of Napoleon with the boy in those years, playing with him in the palace gardens, bringing him to reviews and ceremonies, pointing at the soldiers and the flags, and making the ordinary father's gestures of introduction to the world the child would eventually inherit. The boy was small enough that these gestures were simply the gestures of a large man showing a small one the things around him. The political weight they carried was invisible to the child and carried entirely by the father. In 1814, when the Allied armies entered Paris and Napoleon's first abdication became unavoidable, Marie-Louise took the child and left. The departure was managed by the Allied powers as part of the settlement. Marie-Louise and her son would go to Austria, to the Habsburg court, to the world that Marie-Louise had come from. The child would be raised there. He would be safe. He would also, not incidentally, be entirely within the control of the people who had just defeated his father, which meant that his relationship to his father's legacy and his father's political possibilities would be managed according to their interests rather than his own or Napoleon's. Napoleon was sent to Elba. The father and son were separated. The child was 3 years old. They never saw each other again. In the years that followed, as the child grew up in the Hofburg Palace in Vienna, under the supervision of his Habsburg grandfather Emperor Francis I, and the conservative statesman Metternich, the management of his identity was systematic and thorough. The name Napoleon was removed. He became Franz, which was his Austrian name. His title of King of Rome was replaced with the considerably less charged designation of Duke of Reichstadt, a title that acknowledged his existence without activating any of the political claims that his birth had generated. He was educated in German. His French, the language his father had spoken, was allowed to lapse and then, in the later years, to some extent deliberately suppressed. He was not mistreated. This needs to be said clearly because the story is sometimes told in a way that reduces the Habsburgs to villains and the boy to a prisoner. He was raised with the consideration appropriate to his rank. Educated, fed, clothed, given access to the cultural and military resources of the Habsburg court. He was not a prisoner in any conventional sense. He could walk in the palace gardens. He could ride. He could study. He was, by most accounts, intelligent and curious, and in his personal relationships, warm. But he was also a managed symbol. A living historical artifact that the people responsible for him understood had to be kept inert, maintained in a condition of historical significance without political consequence. The management was not cruel. It was simply thorough. And the thoroughness meant that the connection between the boy and his father, the connection that Napoleon was trying to maintain from Saint Helena through the pages of advice and instruction and memoir that he dictated, was filtered through every intermediary available before it reached the boy, if it reached him at all. Napoleon on Saint Helena received occasional news of his son through the channels available to him. He heard that the boy was healthy. He heard about his education, about his interests, about his development. He received through those same channels the particular pain of hearing his son described in terms that had nothing to do with him. The Austrian boy, the Habsburg grandson, the Duke of Reichstadt, growing up in a world where his father was a historical figure managed at a careful distance rather than apparent. Napoleon sent messages. He dictated instructions to be passed on. He commissioned and authorized the transfer of certain objects, a sword, some documents, things that carried the symbolic weight of inheritance. Whether these arrived, and in what form, and what the boy was told about them, is not entirely clear from the records. What is clear is that Napoleon's son was not given free access to his father's voice. The letters and the instructions and the memoir pages existed, and some of them made their way through the filtration of the Habsburg court in some form. But the version of Napoleon that the boy encountered in those communications was not necessarily the version Napoleon intended. It was the version that the court permitted. The sanitized, historically interesting, politically neutralized version of a father who was being carefully managed into irrelevance. Napoleon dictated a document sometimes referred to as his advice to his son. A text of varying length, depending on which version is consulted, containing his reflections on leadership, on history, on the qualities he believed his son would need if the son were ever to occupy any position of significance. The document is remarkable in several ways. It is written with the clarity and the directness that characterized everything Napoleon produced. It does not sentimentalize the relationship or the situation. It speaks to the boy as an adult, or as a future adult, with the assumption that the boy would eventually be in circumstances where the advice would be actionable. What the document reveals, reading it with attention to what it contains and what it does not contain, is a father writing to a son he cannot reach, across a distance that he understands is not primarily geographical. The distance was political, institutional, historical. The distance produced by the fact that the people responsible for his son had every reason to ensure that Napoleon's voice did not reach the boy in any form that would make the boy want to act on it. Napoleon understood this. The advice he wrote was written with the awareness that it would be filtered and managed and might arrive, if it arrived at all, in a form very different from the form he intended. And yet he wrote it, because not writing it was not a category of response available to him. Because the alternative to dictating advice for a son who might not receive it was simply to sit on Saint Helena and waiting without forward movement had never been something Napoleon could sustain for long. The dictating was motion. The motion was, in the absence of anything else, the most honest expression of who he still was. His son grew up and became something of a young man of genuine quality. Those who observe the Duke of Reichstadt in his later years describe an individual of intelligence and ambition, qualities that the management of his upbringing had not entirely suppressed, perhaps because they were too deeply inherited to be suppressed by any upbringing. He was interested in military affairs. He studied campaigns with the attention of someone for whom campaigns were not merely history, but the family business. He was aware of who his father was and what his father had represented, in the way that people are aware of facts about their family that they have not been allowed to fully inhabit. He asked questions about his father, not always the questions that the people around him wanted him to ask, and not always satisfied by the answers they gave. He had conversations, in the later years of his short life, with people who had actually known Napoleon. Military men, former officials, individuals who had served in the empire and who could speak about the man from direct experience rather than from the carefully managed historical record the Habsburgs preferred. In some of those conversations, something of the real Napoleon reached him. Not the symbol, not the managed historical artifact, but the person. The man who had held him in the Tuileries gardens and pointed at the soldiers and the flags and made the ordinary gestures of a father showing a small child the world. Napoleon died on Saint Helena in May 1821. His son was 10 years old. The news was given to the boy by his grandfather's court with the care that such news requires. Carefully, without drama, in the language of historical significance rather than personal loss. The man who had been Emperor of the French was dead. The Duke of Reichstadt received this information and responded, by the accounts of those present, with a composure that was itself a kind of comment on how the relationship had been managed. He did not weep openly. He did not produce the reaction of a son who has lost a father. He produced the reaction of a young person who has been told that someone historically significant has died. Composed, appropriately solemn, contained. Whether that composure was genuine or whether it was the performance that his formation had trained him to produce regardless of what he felt underneath it, cannot be determined from the outside. He had been raised to be composed about his father. The composure may have been real. It may have cost something that the composure itself prevented from being visible. In the years between Napoleon's death and his own, the Duke of Reichstadt developed an increasing and apparently genuine engagement with his father's legacy. He read the memoirs. He studied the campaigns in detail with the technical attention of someone approaching them, not as historical events, but as problems in his specific inherited vocabulary. He sought out people who had served his father and listened to what they could tell him. He was constructing, in the only way available to him, the relationship with his father that the previous 20 years had not permitted. He died in July 1832. He was 21 years old. The cause was tuberculosis, which had been progressing for some time in the damp, confined air of the Habsburg. He had been ill for months before the end, and the illness had been watched with the careful attention of a court that understood the young man's historical significance and the complexity of his political situation. He died in Vienna, in the palace where he had grown up, surrounded by people who had managed him carefully and who had, in their way, been kind to him. He had never returned to France. He had never stood on the ground of the empire his father had built. He had never commanded anything larger than a regiment, and even that command had been restricted by the careful oversight of people who did not want the son of Napoleon Bonaparte commanding too much. He had read his father's advice in whatever form it had reached him, and had not been in any position to act on most of it. The pages Napoleon had dictated on Saint Helena, the instructions and reflections and advice for the son, existed. Some had been passed on in filtered form. Some had been held by the court and managed in the way the court managed everything related to Napoleon's legacy. Some had been read by the boy and some had not, and which cannot now be fully determined. What can be determined is that the conversation Napoleon had been trying to conduct from Saint Helena, the one-sided, urgent, cross-distance attempt to reach a son he could not reach through a system designed to ensure he could not reach him, was not received in the form it was intended. The advice arrived filtered. The voice arrived edited. The father arrived as a historical figure, rather than as the person who had stood in the Tuileries gardens and pointed at the soldiers, and wept at the birth, and dictated pages of honest instruction that he knew might not arrive, but could not stop himself from writing. Napoleon had known this was likely. He had understood the situation clearly enough to understand that the dictating was probably, in practical terms, futile. The court would manage what reached the boy. The boy would receive a version of a father rather than a father. The inheritance would arrive, if it arrived at all, in the form that the inheritors of Napoleon's defeat preferred it to arrive. He dictated anyway, because the only alternative was silence. And silence, for Napoleon Bonaparte, had never been an option he could choose. Not even at the end, on an island in the South Atlantic, talking to a son who could not hear him in any complete sense, about a world that no longer existed and a future that the son would not live long enough to inhabit. He talked anyway. The pages exist. The son is gone. And the conversation that never quite happened, that was always being attempted and never fully received, remains, perhaps, the most honest monument to what Napoleon Bonaparte actually was, underneath the campaigns and the victories and the code and the legend. A father talking to his son across a distance that could not be closed, still talking, even knowing the distance was there. Still talking, because that was the only thing left that was entirely his own. There is a detail about the Duke of Reichstadt's final days that the larger histories include briefly and the smaller ones sometimes omit entirely. In the weeks before his death in July 1832, as the tuberculosis progressed and it became clear to everyone around him that he was not going to recover, the young man asked for certain objects to be brought to him. Among them were documents related to his father, papers, letters, accounts. Not the official historical record, but the personal material, the things that carried the texture of a person rather than the weight of a symbol. What he read in those final weeks, and what he made of what he read, is not fully recorded. The people who were with him describe a young man who was engaged and focused in a way that the illness made increasingly difficult to sustain. Periods of clarity in which he read and thought and occasionally spoke about what he was reading, followed by the exhaustion that the disease imposed. He spoke about his father in those periods with a directness that the previous years had not always permitted. Not the formal, composed acknowledgement of historical significance, but something more personal. The language of someone trying, in the time available, to close a distance that had never been fully closed. He died on July 22, 1832, in his room in the Hofburg. He was 21 years old. His mother Marie-Louise was not present at his death. She was in Parma, governing the duchy that had been assigned to her in the Vienna settlement, and the news reached her after the fact, through the official channels that carried such news. His grandfather, Emperor Francis I, was in Vienna, and the court managed the death with the careful ceremony appropriate to the passing of someone of historical significance and political complexity. Napoleon had been dead for 11 years. He had dictated his advice and his instructions and his reflections from Saint Helena to a boy who was then 10 years old, and the boy had grown up and died at 21 without having been in any position to use any of it. The empire was gone. The dynasty was extinguished in the direct line. The conversation Napoleon had been trying to conduct from the island was over in the most final way available, without having been properly begun. What remained were the pages. The dictated advice. The instructions for a leader who would never lead anything his father had intended him to lead. The reflections on history and power, and the qualities a man needed to navigate both, addressed to someone who had lived his entire short life inside a structure specifically designed to prevent him from needing those qualities, or having the opportunity to exercise them. The pages are in the archives. They have been read by historians and analyzed and published in various forms. They are part of the record of Napoleon's final years, of the shape of his mind in the period when the mind had nothing left to work on except memory and reflection and the attempt to transmit something across a distance that could not be crossed. Those who read them carefully note something about their tone that distinguishes them from Napoleon's other dictated work. The memoirs and the campaign histories have the quality of construction, the deliberate shaping of a record, the management of how the material will be received. The advice to the son has a different quality. It is more direct, less concerned with how it will be received, more honest about the costs of what Napoleon had done and been and chosen. It reads in places like a conversation rather than a document, like a man talking to someone he is not performing for, because the person he is talking to is not yet formed enough to require performance. Whether the son received this quality in whatever filtered form the advice arrived is unknowable. Whether he read the pages in his final weeks and found in them the voice his upbringing had not allowed him to hear, the actual voice, not the historical artifact, is a question the record cannot answer. What can be said is that Napoleon wrote it, that he directed his words, from the farthest place they had ever sent him, toward the one person he could imagine receiving them without the intermediaries of politics and ambition and historical positioning, the son, the boy, the person who had been carried away at 3 years old and had grown up into someone Napoleon could only imagine. He imagined him carefully. He wrote to him honestly. And the pages remain in the archive, carrying something of what had been intended. The father who kept talking across the distance, because silence was the one thing he could not offer the one person left who might have needed to hear him.